Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series, where vision meets action. The episode is brought to you by AKFI Sustainability Association, initiator of the STS, the Sustainability Transaction Standard, and the world's first non-profit industry consortium uniting ESG, sustainability, AI, and digital transformation. Actionable ESG talks bring together bold thinkers and change makers to shape what's next. Here, we move beyond discussion to ignite the ideas that will define the future of sustainability and digital progress. I'm excited to be here with our guest, Charlie, because the future of ESG doesn't just get discussed here, it gets built. Welcome, Charlie. And
Thank you.
without further ado, just a little bit of his biography. I'll start with the fact that Charlie is the author of What We Can Do, a Climate Optimist Guide to Sustainable Living. Here is the book, and definitely encourage our audience to check it out. He's building from his experience as a prominent sustainability leader in the private sector. And Charlie's book offers readers pragmatic, data-driven steps to maximize sustainability in their personal, professional, and political lives. That's a long introduction. Um, but Charlie, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your career, um, and what
Sure.
what triggered the book.
Yeah, and in some ways you can consider me the accidental environmentalist. Because when I was in college, I didn't take a single class on sustainability or the environment. I thought I wasn't smart enough to do it because at the time I was told you had to go be an environmental engineer to go do sustainability. So instead, I got a degree in physics. But over time, I started feeling the pull to figure out what I could do to pull sustainability into my career. I remember a fateful dinner when I was at my first company where I was with all of our oil and gas clients. And they were all bragging about how if you were to cut them open, they would bleed black because their blood was made of oil. And that was a moment where I was I had that moment of, what am I doing? And then I transitioned and said, what can I do to make my job that I already have, which was a glorified events manager, basically, into a sustainability job? That journey led me to where I am in my day job today as not just the author of this book, but also as a director of sustainability at Microsoft, although this conversation will focus on my perspective as an author. I wanted to write that book to give people a little bit of hope that no matter your background, no matter where you're coming from, you have that opportunity to pull sustainability into everything you do, whether it's the decisions in your personal life, whether it's how you can pull it into your career and make any job a sustainability job, or even just how you engage civically. I think there are a lot more things we've been granted to us that we can use to make a difference on climate change and on the planet that we just might not realize. And that was a lot of the impetus for writing, to like make people feel optimistic that they have the tools they need to make a real change.
So the optimism that we can really manage sustainability, as opposed to say, the sky is broken loose and we have no control over our destiny, if you want.
Yeah, and I think even a greater nuance within that, which is I think you have to acknowledge that things are not the best right now. I mean, I live in Minnesota. I was not able to go outside yesterday because of how bad the wildfire smoke was. And
Right.
that's Minnesota never had a wildfire season when I was growing up. So you have to acknowledge that reality, but you can't let yourself be succumb to it. Because if you succumb
Absolutely.
to it and you end up and you give up, then it's only going to get worse. And so the optimism isn't saying, hey, let's plug our ears and pretend like nothing's happening. It's acknowledging the big challenge, but feeling optimism and feeling encouragement and empowerment in how much fun we can have, frankly, in trying to work on the solutions to do something about this.
And that's exactly they find an engineer, engineers give them a good problem and they'll look for a solution.
Oh
I
yeah.
own I don't, I am an engineer. I don't consider the engineering profession as being an optimistic profession, but I think we'll continue to discuss this throughout the chat today. But usually we start with a question on trends and how do you see the state of sustainability in 2026, both regionally, as you started to mention, and globally? And what should be a real strategy there?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the things that is really cool to look at is how much things are marching on, even if it's quietly. So the first half of the 2020s, I think sustainability was very loud. In 2020, in particular, most large companies, including Microsoft, where I work, set big, ambitious climate goals out to 2030 or 2035 or 2040, and there's a lot of focus on it. And then, when the administration in the United States changed, a lot of people didn't stop the work, but they just got a little bit quieter on the work. And I'll give you some fun examples here is when you go to the store, just look at the packaging and think about how different and better the packaging is now versus even 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we still had blister packs for a lot of stuff, which nobody likes blister packs. They're awful. They cut you when you try to open them. A lot of that packaging is now plant-based. It's recyclable. And that's happening even if people aren't shouting from the rooftops on it. Similarly, one of the things that I think is really exciting is on a global basis, for the first time ever, solar power has produced more energy than coal in a given year, which is amazing. And that's despite all of the headlines suggesting that, there are all these headwinds on the clean energy industry. It's still marching forward. And even on things like electric vehicles, in the United States, the subsidies went away. But there still is, some growth in the sector, and especially abroad. I mean, if you live in Norway, 93%, I believe, of all new cars sold are fully electric vehicles. So, there are these slow transitions happening that might not be so visible and loud anymore, but the good work is very much still happening.
Absolutely. And you know about solar panels. I was chatting with one sustainability from I shouldn't say promoter, uh, more a sustainability activist in
Hmm.
Africa, and he described a case where he was going to a village and they proudly gave him a cold drink, cold water, and was cold because of solar panels in the fridge.
Yeah.
And it was, the first time, the first generation, that was like a status symbol, if you want, having a solar panel.
Totally. But now, like as a great example of this is here in the United States, there's a trend that we're starting to adopt from Europe of plug-in solar, balcony solar, if you might have heard of it. So a traditional solar array is an example. Like I have one on my house. I needed to get a bunch of electricians. I needed to get some installers. I needed to get on my roof, and it was not super cheap. I mean, it pays itself back, but it does have an upfront cost. But nowadays, like in Germany, it's already established. Now I think it's like 10 states have legalized it. You can just go to the store. Like I think in Germany, you just go to the supermarket and you buy a solar panel and then you bring it home and then you plug it in on your balcony and then you can make your own power. That like kind of, individualized power generation revolution isn't just limited to that. If you look at even from satellite imagery of places like Pakistan and in Egypt, you see places where, or Syria, I think it's Syria, where it's like every single roof now has a solar panel on it because they don't want to wait for the grid to get better. They don't want to have themselves be reliant on, fuels controlled by other nations. It's a geopolitical thing now. It's a personal empowerment thing. It's a geopolitical thing. Even put saving the planet aside, which I think is really cool.
But it's also democracy at work. What can
Hmm.
be, more democratic to produce your own power
Oh yeah,
and also be, not explicitly even, but environmentally uh, progressive. If we get in the solar panels, there are still this, limitations in the environment, but I feel it's democracy at work.
Yeah, and you should be able to empower people to have their own source of power, which is really cool. And like, it's people have really focused on the environmental benefit of solar panels, but there's all these other benefits. I'll give a great financial one is guess how expensive my last energy bill for last month was.
Positive or negative?
It was
Because
negative.
some states actually allow you to debit more than you consume, and okay,
Oh yeah, Minnesota is one of those states. So I got paid $40 for my energy bill last month, which is awesome.
okay.
So what's not to love?
If we talked about really trends, uh, some time ago, during one of the interviews, we talked about the fact that once the capital expenditure is amortized, we're talking about larger installations, right? The companies putting solar panels in
Hmm.
their factories and having large installations. Um, the energy produced is practically free. We didn't figure out how to charge for sun. And that changes the dynamic of the pricing of electricity. Why? Because a power plant, nuclear, fossil fuels, it doesn't matter, requires a large investment capex and then ongoing opex because you transform one form of energy in another. Oil and
Hmm.
gas, you burn it, etc., and you produce steam. And so the whole economics of the transformation hasn't been so visible to people.
And I
We
think
have free energy coming up.
Well, I think that point's really important. And I think like, this was the aha that I had, and hopefully your listeners will have this as well after listening to this, which is, if you think about a gas station, think about all of the work that you don't see to get the gas to that gas station. I think the Strait of Hormuz and this war in the Middle East between the United States, Israel, and Iran is like a great example of like even something happening all the way over there impacts that supply chain of how gasoline gets to your gas station. So if anything disrupts that very complex supply chain, you put your ability to continue operating at risk. Versus with my solar panels, they just sit there. I don't need trucks coming to refill them. I don't need anybody to do anything. I bought something that will sit there basically untouched for 30 years and always give me power as long as there's sunlight. And eventually, once battery storage really starts to mature and come around, the question stops becoming like, what is our supply chain to deliver this fuel? It's once we've, to your point, once we've installed these capital assets, what is the cheapest way to get power among the choices for how I spend my money? And it translates into this question of like, what's the cheapest way to charge a battery? And solar is the cheapest way to charge a battery. So it's a long-term transition that gives me a lot of hope that like the economics just, except for in very specific use cases, the economics work out pretty well for clean energy.
I'll sort of divide the world in optimists, pessimists, realists, and idealists. I think we
Sure.
touched on all of them in the conversation, but uh, where they converge and where they diverge, right? Because in our interviews, and we had probably over 100 people visiting with us, thanks to
Hmm.
all of them. We found all the spectrum, from idealists to even nihilists saying no, it's not going to happen. The environment, it's not changing. So, you know, how do you see these distinctions? And
Well, I'll give an example of this in terms of pragmatism. So I think that's always the lens we need to have is our approach pragmatically going to make something happen? So there's a couple of layers to that, I would say. So if you're in a large corporation, like my day job, I'm working at sustainability at Microsoft. I've been a director of sustainability there for several years. When I first joined, there was a little bit of that philosophical debate about what should be the mentality almost of how we approach sustainability. And so one end of it is a little bit more of this kind of, pessimistic compliance mindset of like, you have to do this, you have to do this. We're in trouble. We've got to do this to not get in trouble. We have to do this to not burn the planet. And then realistically, though, you're talking to get things done, you need to inspire people. Either there needs to be an explicit law and a threat to get people like, hey, if you don't do this, there's going to be a significant damage or penalty. But if that isn't immediately in front of you and climate change is kind of not immediately in front of most people, well, then that question is if I've got a very busy day job, I just want to get home to my kids, I'm putting in my 8 hours a day, and I don't want to take on risks. Like, how do you unlock that person to be an ally with you on the journey? Because that would call that person maybe not even a nihilist, maybe someone who does care but just doesn't want to have to do that at work. So the approach that I've taken within Microsoft has been very fun. Like when I took on my team in the cloud business, I started by, I adopted a team that already existed. I told my team on day one, it's like, I have two priorities. The priorities weren't necessarily, hey, let's go save the planet or like, hey, let's make Microsoft a bunch of money. I think those are somewhat implicit. It's more of like, what do we want to do with ourselves? And the number one thing I said is, I want us to have fun. And the second thing I said is, I want other people to have fun with us. Because if other people are having fun with you and you're inspiring them on a hard challenge, or you're inspiring them on this really cool feature for a product, or you're inspiring them on something that fills them up and lets us add to the world, that pragmatically feels to me like the way to activate folks rather than knocking on someone's door and saying, you have 15 minutes to make your product worse for me by taking out all these parts because that'll lower the embodied carbon by 15%. That's not fun. Let's inspire people instead.
So, I sort of think of fun and building optimist as being sort of a related activity, right? Because once you have fun, people tend to see the life in brighter colors, if I may say so, right?
Totally. Well, and I can even give you a great example is in for my book. So, a lot of
Let's
these
go.
insights came from research in the book, but one thing that's really fun is when I went to my publisher. My publisher is named Wise Inc. They're here local in Minnesota to me. And I've got this book idea. I've got 250 pages of content. I've got 250 footnotes. I've done all this research. I have written a book about sustainability. Awesome. When I went to them and I said like, "Hey, I want to work together," the next thing I said was, "But I also want your commitment to work with me to make the book itself the most sustainable book you've ever made." So, like whether or not the writing is the most sustainable, like concepts that they've ever published, fair question. But I said, okay, we're going to do that anyway. Table stakes. Are you willing to partner with me to see what we can do to like minimize the environmental impact of the book? And they're like, no one has ever asked us that, but sounds interesting. Like what, let's give it a shot. Like they don't have sustainability people on staff. They've never done this before. They don't know what they're doing. This could just be seen as a distraction, but to their credit, because it was like an interesting challenge for them, they said, let's figure out what that means. And I can run you through all the fun stuff that we did, but they were amazing partners to it. And it just took me kind of asking and then inspiring and then like saying like, let's figure what that looks like.
And, I encourage our audience to look in the processing of pulp and paper to understand how much of environmental impact has the use of strong chemicals, of heat in production, and so
Oh
on.
yeah.
So that's a big challenge when you go to Wiley and say, "Hey, almost don't use paper."
Well, so that's what's so fascinating. And so for the listeners, I'm sure well, maybe I'm not sure, but it's likely that you've never asked yourself the question of how much energy does it take to make a book? And so we can do some equivalencies. And so maybe I'll even ask you, I want to convert the amount of energy it takes to make the book into how many times you charge your smartphone. Guess how many days of charging a smartphone it takes to make one 250-page book?
I'll make it more in energy for a home because I think the order of magnitude of a smartphone phone will put me in whatever 5 years, 10 years of energy in the smartphone. But I'm an electronic engineer, electrical engineer. So I'll think it's about half a year of maybe 3 months to half a year of a normal home consumption for lighting and fridge and so on. Maybe not air conditioning or heating.
So thankfully it's not that much, which is good. But if you were to take an average book, 250 pages, it's about 2 years of charging a smartphone, which I don't know the conversion of that into how many days of running your house, but it's more than zero. I think people just kind of assume it's like, okay, well, paper comes from tree, paper gets put into a book, book comes to me. But then you think about, well, all of the equipment that's required to, pulp the wood, all of the work to kind of procure the inks, all that supply chain background, plus getting the books physically from your manufacturer to your warehouse, from your warehouse to your distribution center, all over the place. And like,
I'll disclose that I worked for a company for the software of pulp and paper, and the process at that time, there were some years ago, some many years ago, was very heat intensive, chemically aggressive,
oh yeah.
whitening the paper and so on because the pulp is not white, cutting the wood, processing the wood. So I'll be a little bit more skeptical about 2 years of smartphone, but let's try to take it offline and do the measurements.
Well, you actually have the first party experience. This is at least what my publisher was able to calculate for us. So
Okay,
I have to trust the judgment of my publishing team. They found some online tools. One of them is called the Environmental Paper Network's Paper Calculator 4.0. And you put in all the dimensions of your book and the paper type, et cetera, and then it'll spit out its estimation for how much emissions, how much energy, how much water use, how many trees, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless, I think the point though, and this is one of the big things that I talk about in my book, is how do we have a framework to understand the hidden impact that it takes to make things and to move things that we normally don't think about. You're an electrical engineer, so you'll know that most of the work that's been done to make like computers very energy efficient and to extend battery life have brought the energy draw of an average computer down pretty significantly.
sure.
It's really cool, but what that means then is if you look at your average computer, if it's a laptop, like 80% of the emissions of that computer come from making it in the first place and getting it to you. And so like the data is shocking when you go into it. It's like actually you have to use your computer for kind of like a decade before the energy you used to charge it exceeds the energy it took to make it in the first place. And once you know that, and once you're able to, I call it the make it, move it, use it, lose it framework because all emissions of anything kind of fit into those four buckets. Once you know that hidden make it and move it component, that lets you understand how to make more effective decisions in different ways. And a lot of it shifts from like, can I just go out and buy the more energy efficiency thing right away? A lot of it's just how do we use our stuff for longer and repair our things so that we can amortize all the effort it took to make that thing rather than throwing it away before it's done at end of life.
Very interesting. I didn't realize, but right, that's a very good way to look at the life cycle of the products we use, computers included.
Hmm.
Uh, and That leads me to think of the hyperscalers, the large data centers. And I think we're erring on linear prediction, right? We will need more energy for more AI power. I trust the engineering profession to find better solutions for energy efficiency. And just look at the smartphone in your pocket to see how how many IBM mainframes of the 50s fit in your phone would be a question.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the interesting lenses that kind of can sometimes get lost in the discussion about, the emissions of data centers and the emissions of AI is obviously energy use is a significant component for sure. But it's also a solvable one, in the sense of, we have ways to produce carbon-free energy. We have wind, we have solar, we have nuclear, we have geothermal, we have hydropower. Um, and so, that gives us a tool that we can then go deploy to deal with the energy emissions. Energy efficiency, of course, super important because you want to use less, so you have to buy less. You don't need as many solar panels, as an example. If you can cut the amount of energy it takes to use ChatGPT by half. Um, which, by the way, the industry is actually doing a really good job of making AI models more energy efficient to that end. So Google's put out some cool stuff about how much more energy efficient Gemini has gotten. We recently released something similar at Microsoft. But the thing that gets missed in all of this is the reason that the emissions of all these hyperscalers are going up is because of their supply chains. It's because of the materiality, the physical things going into the data centers. So if I build a data center, it's going to use a lot of energy for sure. But it's also got a lot of steel. It's also got a lot of concrete. It's got a lot of huge equipment. It's got all these servers and all this silicon, and that silicon has to get manufactured in a really energy intensive way in Asia, and then it comes back. And there's all these factors, and that's the really interesting kind of almost solution or problem set to go figure out is how do you decarbonize the built environment, not just the energy that goes into the built environment?
Absolutely. No, it's actually, I'll sort of spend a little time to discuss about what AKFI is doing, the Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the
Yeah.
nonprofit I'm um, co-found the non-profit I co-founded, and we working based on on telecom standards, which are probably the most advanced standards of interworking networks. We can talk across continents because of these standards that work,
Hmm.
and thousands of people that created the standard. And we are making a proposal for a standard which we call it the STS. And the STS is the Sustainability Transaction Standard and goes exactly in what you are saying. Now, if you take a sustainability lens as opposed to a supply chain lens, the relationships between the supplier and the customer change drastically. Think of information flows. Before that, the information flow was from the customer to the supplier, what they need, and so on. And a little bit of information back, yes, I'll deliver, I'm late, and so on.
Hmm.
And now it's almost a reverse trend. The sustainability information coming from the supply chain is more massive than the sustainability information you have in case of reporting and so on. You depend on your supply chain, as you very well indicated, and that's a great example of hyperscalers.
Oh yeah.
And we're working with an organization called Bixi that nobody that I know heard of in telecom industry, and is the one which specifies actually the data center and the telecom centers and the wiring and the plant. And the Bixi organization is one of our targets for promoting these standards. So
And as an example of why those standards are so important is if you let people kind of all do it their own way, you start to lose a little bit of trust with communities. And I think, one of the questions you asked at the very beginning is what are some of the trends I'm seeing more broadly? And I think one of the trends that I'm seeing more broadly, especially in my industry, is this shift away from these global problems is increasingly down to these hyper local problems. And so, very proud. One of the things that our team just did last week is disclose exactly how much water and energy all of our data centers use in every metro where we operate, which is cool. Love giving that transparency, but there's no standard for it. And so, we might measure it in a slightly different way than Google does, than Amazon does. And that leads people to ask questions like, is this trustworthy data? If there's a standard behind the data and a standard behind the data set, that is something that can give people a little bit more certainty that the numbers are real. The numbers are very real, by the way, just to be very clear. Like we spent 6 months pulling those bad boys together. We are very confident in them. But I posted this on LinkedIn, and one of the first comments that I got on this page. There's like 700 people have hit like, so it's been, viral. I don't know if that's viral for LinkedIn, but it's, a lot of people have seen it. One of the first people that commented said, "And you believe Microsoft?" And I had to respond like, well, yes, because my team did this. But that's like there's distrust, and I think that distrust has to be met by, having things that people do trust verify and qualify the sustainability work, so people don't get burned by this fear of us all like trying to greenwash.